hello everyone. So we're back. Last time we talked about the overview of the speaking test. Now I'm going to give you a little quiz. I've put some numbers here on the board, and I want you to try to understand what the relationship of these numbers are to the speaking test. Before we get to today's video, which today we're going to be covering speaking part 1, but the first number I want you to look at is the number 4. What does the number 4 mean in regards to the speaking test? What does that number 4 mean? Can anybody tell me? Okay, good. So the number 4 is actually the 4 criteria that they're measuring when they grade you. Remember, we talked about fluency and coherence, lexical, grammar, and pronunciation. So 4 refers to the number of criteria that they're grading you on. What about the number 11 to 15? Does anybody know what 11 to 15 is? Good job. Yes, 11 to 15 is the amount of time the entire speaking test takes. It takes between 11 to 14 to 15 minutes for the speaking test. So that's what that number is. How about the number 3? You got it. The number of parts in the speaking test. We have speaking part 1, part 2, and part 3. Part 1 is information about yourself. Part 2 is the individual long term. And part 3 is the conversation, the back and forth between the candidate and the examiner. And the number 9, okay, you guessed it. That's the top score for your band. In other words, there's a band score that they're giving you based on the criteria. And the number 9 is the the top score that you can receive in the IELTS. So I know all of you are going for a 9, so remember the 9, okay? And the last number is 1 to 2. Yeah, correct. This is about speaking part 2. This means that you have 1 minute to prepare and 2 minutes to speak. Okay, so let's get down to speaking part 1. Okay, so let's go to part 1. I want to look at, part 1 is kind of divided up into 2 parts. In the first part of part 1, the examiner is looking for you to begin speaking. So in the very first part, there's some information that'll be covered, like your name and your student ID number or your passport. So you'll give that information. When you give your name, make sure you do it in Vietnamese. So if your name is Nguyen Thi Hum, your name is that way. When you give your information to the examiner, you want to make it clear so they can hear it. You don't want to talk too fast. You don't want to go blah, 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 because it's too fast. The examiner can't hear it. Now, the examiner has your name, so just make sure you say your name clearly, just the way it is on your ID or your passport. Okay, so that's the first part. The next part is when they, there's two parts to part 1. The first part is they're going to ask you maybe what do you do? So this is usually do you work? Or are you a student? When you're answering the questions in part 1, be sure to answer the question first. Don't talk what you plan to say. Answer the question first. For example, if it's a yes or no question, answer yes or no, and then give your reason, with a because, or whatever you want to say after that. Don't think about what you're going to say later. Think about the question first. So you always want to answer the question first, so that way you show the examiner that you understood the question. And another thing, when I'm speaking the way I'm speaking right now, this is the way the examiner will speak, because they're not going to slow down for you to catch up to them. In other words, it's natural speech. So you have to have the ability to listen to the examiner speak at a normal speech. So he'll say, he'll do something like, what do? Do you work, or are you a student? And then there's a series of questions after that. There's probably a variety of 10 different questions about do you work, or are you a student? And after you answer that question, they might ask you, what do you do? What's your job? Describe your job. What do you like about your job? Things like that. And then they'll do the same thing for the student. What do you like most about your school? Where do you study? Things like that. So that, again, there's a variety of questions that you could answer. You have to think, if you work, you have to think, what possible questions would they ask me about my job? And if you're a student, what possible answers could they ask me about being a student? So it's just going to depend, and there's usually a series of between 3 and 4 questions here, and you'll go through those questions. And then, so that's one question. The other choice, they're either going to choose this question, or they're going to choose one about where you live, or possibly your home. So there's a variety of questions there. They could talk about the area you live in, what part of Vietnam do you live in, what part of Hanoi do you live in, what's your neighborhood like, what are the shops like in your neighborhood. There could be a variety of things. The one about the home, they'll usually ask you to describe your home. And when you describe your home, remember, they're not asking you about your family, who do you live with. They're asking you to tell you about your home. So when you're talking about your home, what color is it? Okay, what color is it? How big? Rooms. Okay? So you want to talk about your living room, your kitchen, your dining room, if you have a dining room, your bedrooms, your bathrooms. So you're talking about your rooms. And again, if you go into more detail, you can talk about the color of your rooms, how big your room is. They want you to describe your house or your apartment. That's another thing. House, apartment, or flat. So that's your home. So again, there's a series of questions here. And after they do, and again, the examiner will choose either this or this question they ask. And again, there's a little bit more variety with these, because it could be about your home and it could be about your neighborhood, your area that you live in. But this one is pretty standard. And again, they're going to choose one of these two, and then after that, you'll get into the main part of part 1. This usually takes between 1 to 2 minutes. And again, there's a series of 3 questions here. So that's the first part of part 1. Now I'm going to talk about some of the possible subjects that you'll get in the second part of part 1. So we'll continue that in just a second. Okay, so after we get through the first part, the first 1 or 2 minutes, after we get through the what do you do question and where do you live or what's your home like question, after that there's a list. There's a lot of questions that they could talk about, and this is where there's a set of 2 more questions. In other words, there's 4 questions for one set, and if the speaker is good, you'll usually get through the second block of questions, which is another 4 questions. So there's a variety of topics that you could get in the second part of part 1. Some of the typical topics that you'll get might be talking about music. They might talk about some of the music you like, do concerts, things like that. There's been questions about history, science. Okay, so there's questions about those things. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions now about technology. So modern technology like the internet, mobile phones, cell phones, computers. There's a lot of questions about that. There's questions about population, and then this might be something like the cities versus the countryside. Okay? There's a lot of comparison questions too. Like for example, in this one they might talk about the cities and the countrysides. They may talk about houses. In other words, what type of houses you have in your country. Because certain countries have different typical types of houses. And they might even tie the houses into the city and the countryside. So what's the difference with the houses in the city? Some people like to talk about the fact that there's a lot of apartments in cities and a lot larger homes in the countryside because there's more space. So they might talk about things like that, like the houses. There's questions about clothes, your relatives, travel, both in country and abroad. So you might have some of that. Questions about that. Questions about your work. Again, types of different jobs that you might get, again, in country, abroad. Transportation. Photography. Basically, people, any topic that you could think of, they can ask. There's hundreds of different topics, and they change them a lot. So the topics are rotated. So you'll have many different types of topics. They'll also cover things that are popular now, things that are going on at this point in history or in the time that we're in now. There'll be more topics. I've listed a few here. There's more. I'm sure as we go through these series of videos that I'll mention some that I didn't put up here. And again, like I said, there's hundreds. I could spend 20 minutes just listing all the different topics. But here's just a sample of some of the things that they'll give you on the test. And again, like I said, after you get done with the what do you do and housing or living situation, they'll pick 2 of these to talk about. So you might talk about music for 3 or 4 questions, and then you talk about history for another 3 or 4 questions. And then that happens, and these are called information about you. So most of these, or actually all of these questions are about you, so you'll answer them in the first person. And again, you'll answer questions like yes or no. You always need to have a reason. So for all of your answers, you should always have a because. You shouldn't just stop very short. A lot of people stop short. Like what kind of music do you like? I like pop. It's too short. I like pop music because. And you want to say why you like pop music. Oh, I like pop music because it's very popular and most people like to dance to it or sing to it, whatever. You want to make sure you have full, complete answers. One thing that I always tell my students when I'm teaching speaking is always in your mind, think of these questions. What, where, why, who, how, and when. When you're answering a question, think about some other answers that you can say. Instead of a one-word answer or one sentence, think of another sentence you can add. Like for example, if you're talking about transportation, and let's say you go to work every day, you could say something like, well, I usually travel by motorbike and I usually go by myself. Now, but if you took your car, maybe you take someone with you. Well, I usually travel to work with my wife, or I travel with my girlfriend, or I pick up my friend along the way. So that's a who question. You know, how do you get to work? Do you go by bus? Do you go by train? Do you go by car? What is it? When do you go? Oh, I go early in the morning. I usually go at 6 before traffic. Otherwise, I get caught in the rush hour. Things like that. So this is another way for you to remember you can add more things. You know, where do you go? Oh, I work in the inner city, or I work in downtown. I work in the city. What do you, and again, what? You know, so you can answer a what question. Well, what do you do? Oh, I'm a construction engineer, so I have to leave early in the morning to help build houses. Whatever it is, think of these question types, and it'll help you add maybe one more sentence, maybe 2 more sentences, and that shows that you're very comfortable with your English. Okay? So there's just a little few tips about part 1. We're going to talk a little bit more about part 1 in other parts of the series of videos. So you'll hear some of this again. I'll probably mention some topics I haven't talked about before, but remember these 6 question types. These will help you as well. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.